They didn't call it a classroom anymore. They called it a training ground of the nation. Imagine stepping into school at 8 years old and instead of bright posters or a blackboard filled with math, the first thing you see is Adolf Hitler's portrait staring down at you, higher than the teacher, higher than the cross, higher than anything else in the room. This wasn't just a school. It was the first battlefield. And the children sitting at those wooden desks were the soldiers in training. Subscribe. Hit the like button right now. Because what you're about to hear will change the way you think about childhood in Nazi Germany. The walls were stripped of anything neutral. Maps didn't show countries as equals. They showed enemies and targets. The globe wasn't about oceans and continents. It was about living space to be conquered. Every lesson, every exercise, even the morning greeting, was an oath to the Führer. Teachers were no longer just teachers. They were sworn members of the National Socialist Teachers League, required to pass ideological exams before they could step inside a classroom. Their job wasn't to teach reading and writing. Their job was to shape soldiers, obedient and fanatical. A child's day began with a Hitler salute. Little arms raised, voices chanting, "Heil Hitler!" before a single page of homework was opened. It was drilled into them until it became as automatic as breathing. Even the youngest couldn't escape it. 5-year-olds in kindergartens were taught songs about loyalty, sacrifice, and racial superiority. Their childhood rhymes turned into propaganda chants. Inside the classroom, the cult of personality was overwhelming. Every subject bent itself around Hitler. Reading books weren't fairy tales or fables. They were stories of German boys who grew strong and brave by following the Führer's words. Arithmetic problems asked, if one bomber carries 12 bombs, how many bombs do 3 bombers carry? Math wasn't about logic. It was about destruction. Geography lessons didn't ask students to name rivers. They asked them to identify territories Germany must reclaim. Even art class had one approved topic: sketching swastikas, eagles, or heroic Aryan warriors. The message was clear. The classroom was no longer neutral ground. It was a weapon. Teachers demanded not curiosity, but loyalty. Those who questioned too much, even children, were reported to the principal, or worse, to the Hitler youth leaders who visited schools regularly. Parents who dared to complain risked being labeled disloyal. In Nazi Germany, raising questions about what your child was being taught wasn't just frowned upon. It was dangerous. Discipline was merciless. Boys who failed to recite party slogans were punished in front of their classmates. Girls who didn't show enough racial pride were humiliated with lectures about their duty to one day bear Aryan children. Schools weren't about nurturing. They were about breaking down resistance and reshaping identity from the ground up. And it worked. Children went home and corrected their parents if they didn't speak in the proper National Socialist terms. Some even reported their own families to local authorities, believing it was their patriotic duty. The line between classroom and battlefield blurred until there was no line at all. But behind the routine, behind the chants and drills, there was something even darker. The way knowledge itself was twisted into ideology. Because this wasn't only about loyalty to Hitler. It was about learning to hate, step by step, subject by subject, day after day. And that is where we'll go next. Into the textbooks themselves, where biology, history, and even grammar were turned into weapons of indoctrination. What children learned on the page would decide how they acted on the streets, and one day, on the battlefield. So before we turn the page to see what those lessons looked like, make sure you're subscribed and hit like. Because this is only the beginning of what was happening inside a Nazi classroom. Open a Nazi school book from the 1930s, and you won't find neutral facts. you'll find lessons sharpened into weapons. Biology wasn't about cells or plants. It was about race. Teachers pointed to charts showing the so-called Nordic type, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, and declared it the highest form of humanity. Children were asked to measure their skulls, their noses, even the color of their eyes, then compare them against charts ranking races from valuable to inferior. Imagine being 10 years old and told that your worth could be calculated with a ruler. History was rewritten line by line. Germany's defeat in World War I wasn't explained by complex politics or military strategy. It was reduced to a single narrative: betrayal by Jews and communists. Teachers hammered the stab-in-the-back myth into every lesson, portraying Jews as parasites who had conspired to weaken the nation. Instead of analyzing treaties or alliances, students memorized propaganda slogans. The message was simple: Germany had been robbed, and it was their generation's duty to take revenge. Even math problems carried poison. Pages asked, "The construction of a lunatic asylum costs 6 million Reichsmarks. How many houses for healthy German families could be built for the same price?" Another, "A bomber carries 12 bombs. How many bombs will fall if 3 bombers attack a city?" Children weren't being trained to calculate. They were being trained to dehumanize, to see people as numbers, to see war as arithmetic. Grammar books slipped in subtle cues, too. Reading exercises contained sentences like, "The Jew is a parasite," or "Adolf Hitler is our Führer. We obey him." These were not innocent practice lines. They were drills designed to make hatred automatic, unconscious, and repeated hundreds of times until it became as natural as saying, "Good morning." And then came the heroes. Textbooks told stories of Aryan boys who fought bravely, sacrificed themselves for Germany, or reported traitors in their own families. These tales were held up as moral lessons. To be good wasn't to be kind or curious or generous. It was to obey, to sacrifice, and to serve the Reich without hesitation. Girls read stories of young maidens whose greatest duty was to grow up healthy, pure, and ready to bear children for soldiers. Education didn't teach individuality. It taught roles: the warrior and the mother. This indoctrination reached deep. Children began correcting their parents at the dinner table. They came home singing war songs. They filled their notebooks with swastikas. Many of them, barely teenagers, started reporting neighbors or relatives who spoke against the regime. The classroom had done its work. It had turned trust into suspicion, learning into propaganda, and childhood into preparation for conflict. By the late 1930s, the line between school and the Hitler Youth was almost gone. Every subject in school pushed children closer toward uniforms, marches, and weapons. Knowledge had been replaced with ideology, and curiosity replaced with hatred. Step by step, children were being taught not just what to think, but who to hate. And yet, this was only part of the preparation. Lessons in hate were paired with lessons in strength. The next stage didn't take place on paper, but in the gymnasiums, the fields, and the playgrounds, where every child learned that their body was not their own, but a tool for the state. When did you finish school in your country? Write it in the comments. I want to know what childhood meant where you grew up. Because in Nazi Germany, childhood meant something very different. And in the next part, we'll step onto the training fields, where classes turned into drills, and children learned to run, fight, and march their way into war. Step outside the Nazi classroom, and you stepped into another kind of lesson, one taught with sweat, bruises, and discipline. Physical education wasn't a side subject. It was central. Officials openly declared, The future soldier must be trained in school. That meant math and reading could be shortened, but sports hours were doubled. Children weren't preparing for exams. They were preparing for war. Boys lined up in shorts and boots, their teachers barking orders like drill sergeants. Push-ups, long-distance runs, climbing walls, wrestling. Every exercise was chosen with the battlefield in mind. They weren't trying to build well-rounded athletes. They were forging endurance, obedience, and the ability to take pain without question. A boy who collapsed during training was called weak, unworthy, even shamed in front of his peers. Strength wasn't just physical. It was political. To be strong was to be loyal to the Reich. Girls had their own regime. They weren't trained to fight on the battlefield. But they weren't spared from militarization either. Their lessons emphasized running, gymnastics, and health, all with one goal: to become mothers of healthy Aryan children. Teachers told them bluntly, "Your body is not yours. It belongs to Germany." The idea of personal dreams or careers was erased. For girls, physical education meant preparing to give birth to the next generation of soldiers. This physical training connected directly to the Hitler Youth and its female branch, the League of German Girls. At first, it was after school. Soon, it became inseparable. Boys would leave class and march in formation through the streets, chanting slogans, singing military songs, carrying flags. Summer vacations weren't for rest. They were for paramilitary camps. Wooden rifles replaced toys. Hiking trips turned into endurance marches with heavy packs. Nights around campfires weren't about stories. They were about propaganda speeches. The Hitler Youth became a parallel school, one that completed the work begun in the classroom. Teachers filled the mind with ideology. The Hitler Youth hardened the body and spirit. Together, they created a generation that believed war was not horror, but destiny. By the age of 14, many boys could field strip a rifle, march 20 kilometers, and navigate through forests at night. By 16, they were being funneled straight into pre-military programs. And there was no escape. Membership became mandatory in 1936. Parents who tried to keep their children out faced threats, investigations, even jail. Children who resisted were mocked as cowards, ostracized by classmates, sometimes beaten. The system had no cracks left. Every child was inside it. One survivor later recalled that the hardest part wasn't the drills or the punishments. It was the silence. Teachers never spoke of peace. Leaders never spoke of kindness. No one ever told the children that life could be about joy, discovery, or dreams. Every lesson, in school, in the gym, in the Hitler Youth camps, pointed to one inevitable end: war. And so, when war finally came in 1939, many of these children were ready, or thought they were. The uniforms, the chants, the weapons training, it had all promised glory. What it delivered instead was mud, blood, and a front line where the enemy didn't care how loyal you were to the Führer. Because the final test of Nazi education wasn't in the classroom, or in the gym, or in the Hitler Youth camps. It came when yesterday's students found themselves holding rifles on real battlefields, facing death before they had even finished growing up. And that's where we're going next, into the brutal reality of those graduates of the Nazi classroom, who walked out of school desks and straight into the trenches of World War II. By 1943, the promise of glory that filled Nazi classrooms met its cruel reality. The same boys who had once solved arithmetic problems about bombs were now carrying real ones. Teenagers, some barely 15, were drafted straight from the Hitler Youth into the Wehrmacht, or worse, the SS divisions. Their lessons in discipline and loyalty had worked. They obeyed orders without question. But on the battlefield, obedience was no shield against artillery shells. Imagine a classroom emptied in the morning and a trench filled that same night. Students who had chanted songs about victory now crouched in mud, clutching rifles that shook in their hands. Teachers who once drilled them in Nazi slogans were now officers screaming at them to hold the line against Soviet tanks. Childhood ended the moment the first shell landed nearby. Accounts from survivors are haunting. Boys too young to shave were sent to man anti-aircraft guns as Allied bombers tore through German cities. In the last months of the war, entire units of Hitler Youth were thrown against seasoned Soviet troops. They fought desperately, believing they were defending their homeland. But the result was slaughter. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of children died in battles that historians now call hopeless from the start. For the girls, the tragedy was different, but no less brutal. The League of German Girls had promised them pride and purpose as future mothers of the Reich. But as the front collapsed, many were forced into labor, nursing wounded soldiers in makeshift hospitals, or worse, caught in the chaos of advancing armies. Their education had not prepared them for starvation, displacement, or the violence that swept across Germany in the war's final years. The system had achieved its aim. It had turned classrooms into training camps, textbooks into weapons, and children into soldiers. But the price was staggering. When the Reich fell in 1945, millions of German youth were left scarred, not just physically, but mentally. They had been robbed of childhood, robbed of choice, robbed of the chance to learn anything other than obedience and hate. And that is the ultimate legacy of the Nazi classroom. It wasn't just about teaching math with bombs or biology with lies. It was about erasing innocence. It was about ensuring that when war came, there would be no hesitation, no doubt, no mercy, even from children. But history remembers the truth. The graduates of this education system didn't march into glory. They marched into catastrophe. Many never came home. Those who did carried memories they could never erase. Friends buried too soon, lessons that turned into nightmares, and the bitter realization that the classroom they trusted had betrayed them. When we talk about World War II, we often focus on generals, battles, and strategies. But behind every tank destroyed, every trench defended, there were faces, young faces, shaped by a school system designed not to educate, but to indoctrinate. A system that turned pencils into rifles, playgrounds into drill fields, and children into soldiers. And that is why remembering matters. Because the moment a classroom stops teaching critical thought and starts teaching blind loyalty, it stops being a school. It becomes a weapon.